Good morning. And we have Titus now and singing songs and whatnot, and sometimes we sing to him. We have to be careful singing that song in front of him, though. We'll have a lot of questions later on. I know that's one of Megan's favorite hymns, too, and I've told her you got to watch out. We'll see. Good morning, everyone. We'll see how this goes. On the way here, I ate half of a waffle and part of a scone. So it's a lot of bread. I'm feeling ready for a nap now, so we'll see if we can make it through this. So just starting off here, a couple weeks ago, my dad talked about, he's been preaching through 1 Corinthians, and he talked about issues of conscience, which is, there's a couple lessons on that with the eating of the meat and whatnot, and I think actually if you look through 1 Corinthians, this issue comes up again in a similar context, which is in this sort of, this gray area of sorts, right, where the same action, the same independent specific act could either be wrong or not wrong, or sin or not sin, depending on the circumstance, right? And in that context, one of the classic examples of something that might be an issue of conscience, and this was discussed, but just as a kind of a background here, is issues of dress, right? Like that's one of the classic examples of some people's conscience says you have to wear this, some people's conscience says you have to wear this, and those people's minds, that's the right way to do it. But the Bible doesn't have a specific thing that says you have to preach in a suit on Sunday, right? There's people, especially in the mid-20th centuries, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that said, if you're not wearing right, or if you ain't preaching in white, you ain't living right. So there's these different concepts that go along with that, but the Bible doesn't say you have to be preaching in white. The Bible doesn't say you have to wear a suit or anything. In that context, what the Bible says is you're supposed to have modest apparel. But the issue with modest apparel, at least in this context, is what does that mean, right? That could mean one thing to one person, means one thing to another person. Sometimes you have more of affinity or an inclination towards one thing or the other. But you have this kind of a gray area, right? And I think the Bible as a whole has a lot more nuance than I think sometimes we're led to believe, right? When you look at this issue of conscience, you start seeing that. Or even something like, the great commandment is love God, right? And then love your neighbor as yourself. But what does that look like in a specific scenario? What does love your neighbor as yourself look like? Loving your neighbor is a pretty broad principle, but reasonable people could disagree even if they both would agree that you should love your neighbor as yourself. But what does that look like in a specific context might vary from one person or another. They might have a different opinion on what that looks like, which is why if you're debating someone or you're talking to someone about spiritual things or something, it's often not enough to say, well, I believe the Bible, right? Or I'm a Bible-believing Christian, because any of these people that have different thoughts on this are all going to say that they believe the Bible. But it's not about whether you believe the Bible or not, right? It's about how you interpret these various passages. And that's where a lot of the majority of our practical decisions come in, and why almost no specific act, and I have to kind of couch this a little bit. I'm not saying everything's relative and nothing's right and nothing's wrong, but I'm saying there's not much of a specific independent act that is always wrong or always right. And even if you look at something, if I were to poll everyone and say, what's the worst thing someone could do, most of you would probably say, well, like kill someone, right? But killing someone isn't always wrong biblically, right? There's things like capital punishment. There's things like self-defense. That's why in law and in most, in the legal realm, murder or homicide is defined as the unlawful killing of another human being, because there are methods of lawfully killing someone. And so even that specific act, I'm not saying murder's right, but I'm saying the specific individual or distinct act of killing someone, even if something is what we consider as bad as that, the specific act itself can either be right or wrong depending on the context. And there's situations where, those things come into play. So with that kind of in mind as background, to go to Exodus 1. And I was thinking through, I don't know, my dad asked me to teach maybe, sometime maybe 10 days ago or so. And I was reading through Exodus 1 sometime last week, maybe Monday or Tuesday. And I come across, I'm just reading this randomly, and I was thinking, I don't know what I want to teach on today. But look at Exodus 1, verse 9, and it says, and this is, you're familiar with the story, right? This is when Pharaoh Well, we'll read it, but you're familiar with the story. It says in verse 9, "And he said unto his people, Behold," this is Pharaoh, "and he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land." Skip ahead to verse 15. And it says, "And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said," so here's Pharaoh talking to these two midwives, and he's telling them this: "When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew woman, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live." There's this command: kill the sons that are born. "But the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive." So I think you have an aspect here of disobedience to the civil authority. Talk about that a little bit later, but that's not what I want to focus on here. It says, "So they kept the children alive." And then verse 18, "And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing and have saved the men children alive?" Well, in verse 17, it says they feared God. That's the reason, right? It says they feared God and did not as the king commanded them. Verse 18, he asked them why they did it. In verse 19, the midwife said unto Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them." So they don't say, "We didn't kill them because we fear God." He said, "We didn't kill them because they give birth too quick. We can't get there in time to kill the children. We can't get there in time to kill the men." Best case scenario, that's some sort of deception. Worst case scenario, they're lying to him. And we see in verse 20, what's the response? "Therefore God dealt well with the midwives." So we see Pharaoh tells them to do this. They disobey Pharaoh. Then they lie, or at least deceive him. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. They at least deceive Pharaoh into doing this, or into why they did this. And then in verse 20, God dealt well with them. So you see this scenario, and what does this have to do with issues of conscience? Well, nothing directly, but it got me thinking about this sort of gray area aspect of Christian ethics, right? So you have this conscience area of Christian ethics, and I'm looking at this other area here, and the concept here is, how do we obey God when two biblical principles seem to pull in opposite directions, right? So you have the principle here of not lying to the Pharaoh or maybe obeying civil authorities, and then you have another principle of obeying God. And these things sometimes appear to conflict or appear to clash, and I was reading that and I was like, well, let's do something on that. So then that got me looking through, and man, this is a big rabbit hole of stuff I started getting into this week. And there's multiple competing views on this. And they're not even, a lot of times you get into something and there'll be a whole bunch of competing views and all these name theories and stuff, but they tend to fall along party lines where it's like if you're more conservative or more liberal, you kind of have this one thing. Or if you're Baptist or Presbyterian or Lutheran or whatever, you tend to fall along these same type of lines. This is all over the place. I mean, there's people in the same exact, doctrinal beliefs on pretty much everything else, but they'll hold this and they'll hold this. So this is quite the rabbit hole that I got myself into this week, but I'm taking you into the rabbit hole with me this morning. So we can both see what we can figure out here, or at least get everyone confused in the next 40 minutes and won't know what to believe anymore. So we'll see what happens. All right, so that's kind of the background here. So I want to look at some examples, and we're going to just go through a whole list of different things just to kind of give a background of these apparent ethical dilemmas that we see in the Bible. So the first one we see here is Exodus 1. Go over to Joshua 2, and this is probably the most famous and the one that always comes up as an example of a potential apparent ethical conflict of moral duties. And we're going to look at several of these. We'll keep going back to this one just because it's kind of the quintessential one. And you know the story here. It's Rahab and the spies, right? So in Joshua chapter 2, it says in verse 1, "And Joshua the son of Nun sent out of Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, Go view the land, even Jericho. And they went and came into an harlot's house named Rahab and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, Behold, there came men in hither tonight of the children of Israel to search out the country. And the king of Jericho sent unto Rahab, saying, Bring forth the men that are come to thee, which are entered into thine house, for they be come to search out all the country. And the woman, Rahab, took the 2 men and hid them, and said thus, There came men unto me, but I wist not whence they went. whence they were. So she hid them, she lied to them about where they were hidden at. And it came to pass about the time of the shutting of the gate, when it was dark, that the men went out. Whither the men went, I wot not. Pursue after them quickly, for ye shall overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof of the house, and hid them with the stalks of the flax, which she had laid in order upon the roof. So this is probably the most famous example in all of the Bible about someone doing something, about lying. And the reason she's lying is people come to their house and say, where are these people you're hiding? And she says, I don't know what you're talking about. They went out that way. Meanwhile, she hid them up in the roof, and she was completely lying about it. So there's one example, and we'll come, and I'm not saying, I'm not going into a bunch of background on this right now. I'm just leading through some examples, and we'll kind of get into an analysis later on. So continuing forward in your Bible, go to 1 Samuel 16. I just want to point out and show all of these. There's quite a few. There's a lot of examples, and we're not going to look at all of them, but 1 Samuel 16, verse 1. This is an interesting one because God's directly involved in this one. Chapter 16, verse 1 says, And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. So God tells Samuel, you're going to go and you're going to anoint David, right? And verse 2, And Samuel said, How can I go? If Saul hear it, he will kill me. So Samuel says, well, okay, I'm down with going, but if I go, Saul's going to kill me. So what does God tell Samuel to do? And the Lord said, Take an heifer with thee and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. Right? So he's told to go and anoint David. He says he's going to kill me if I do it. And God says, well, tell him you're there to sacrifice. So again, best case scenario, this is some sort of deception, right? This is him saying you're not telling him the full truth, right? And I'll bring this up now, but this applies to all these different scenarios we're looking at. If you look at this and you say, and you might think, he's not lying. This isn't a lie. Maybe he is going to sacrifice. Titus is 7 years old. He's not lying to us yet. But if I ask Titus in 3 years, 4 years, and say, did you brush your teeth? And he says, yes. And in his mind, he's thinking, yeah, I brushed them yesterday, right? Is he lying about saying yes? Not directly, right? But you would absolutely understand him to be lying if he said that, right? Or for instance, if you have kids and they're older and you say, they get home late one night and you say, where were you? And they say, oh, I was stuck in traffic. And it's like, well, they were stuck in traffic, but that was on the way back from, their girlfriend's house, right? They're not lying about being stuck in traffic. Or if you're working and you get home late and your wife says, where were you? And you say, I had a work meeting that went late. And you did, but then you went to the bar afterwards, or whatever. Like, that's not a lie directly. But I think if any of this happened in our scenario, we would view that and say, you're not telling us the truth. You're at least deceiving. So I think there's this aspect of you try to say, well, he's not really telling the lie. He is going to sacrifice. But if you're leading the person into believing that's the reason you're there, that's the only reason you're there, I think it falls into the same bucket. So anyway, and in this passage, in verse 3, it says, And call Jesse to sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do, and thou shalt anoint a name. And Samuel did that which the Lord spake. So presumably he did run into Saul, and he did say he was going to sacrifice. And then in verse 5, he ends up asking Jesse to bring his sons out. So that's an example there. Go just a couple chapters forward to verse 19, or chapter 19. In chapter 19, and we're probably going to run out of time. I won't have time to go through all of these examples verse by verse. But in chapter 19, verse 11, you have Michal lying to Saul about David to save his life. And it says in verse 11, Saul also sent messengers unto David's house. This is after Saul tried to kill him with a spear. David starts running. Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So he's going to die if he doesn't do something. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed, and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster, and covered it with a cloth. So there's a deception right there. And when Saul sent messengers to David, she said, He is sick. And Saul sent the messengers again to see David, saying, Bring him up to me in the bed, that I may slay him. And when the messengers were come in, behold, there was an image in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster. And Saul said unto Michal, Why hast thou deceived me so, and sent away mine enemy, that he escaped? And Michal answered and said, He said unto me, Let me go, why should I kill thee? So another example here, you have the deception, you have lying. In chapter 20, we see the same thing again. and we're going to have to, well, I won't go through all the verses, but in 1 Samuel 20, verses 24 through 29, you have a scenario. This is when Jonathan and David are having this plot where he's going to go out into the field, shoot the arrows, and then however far they go, that's going to, let David know what Saul's opinion of what was going on. But in the midst of this, you have Jonathan sitting with Saul at dinner, and Saul says, "Where's David at?" And he's like, "Well, I don't know where he went. I think he went to Jerusalem to do something." And then after that, Saul knows he's lying, and he throws a spear at Jonathan, because he knew he was lying about that. Throws a spear at Jonathan, and then Jonathan goes out, shoots the arrow. So you have another situation there. 2 Kings, as we're going through here, we see another example here in 2 Kings 10. 2 Kings 10, verse 18 and 19. And this is where you have the issue of Jehu. And Jehu was going to gather all these Baal worshipers together so that he could get them all in one place and God could kill them. Well, how did Jehu get them all into one place? In verse 18 it says, "And Jehu gathered all the people together and said unto them, Ahab served Baal a little bit, but Jehu shall serve him much." Well, that's not what he was doing. He wasn't serving Baal, right? He was serving God. And then it even says at the end of verse 19, "But Jehu did it in subtlety to the intent that he might destroy the worshipers of Baal." So you have, again, Jehu lying about what his beliefs were so he could get everyone together. What's the result of that? God ends up killing him. So God follows through with what Jehu's plan was. So he seems to at least have some involvement or agreeing with at least the outcome there. Judges, continuing forward. Or I guess that's not forward. I got out of order here. We're going back for once. Judges chapter 16. This is an interesting one, maybe hadn't thought of before, but it's this issue of suicide versus sacrifice. Suicide's bad. Sacrifices tends to be good. Both of them are killing yourself. But in Judges 16, verse 30, Samson says, "And Samson said, 'Let me die with the Philistines.'" So he's basically asking, in a sense, he's committing suicide, right? He's asking to die. He's asking God to kill him so that he can do something else. And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which were in his life. So you have this issue of suicide versus sacrifice. And then just briefly touch on some others, because there's a lot of military deception related things. In Joshua 8, you have AI being ambushed. And there's a lot of situations with military perspective where you're deceiving people, you're ambushing people. You see this nowadays with like code breakers, and even in, if you're familiar, I'm not super familiar with history, but in World War II, I mean, they did all sorts of crazy stuff. There was, I don't know if you knew, Jim, you probably know, with D-Day, they were trying to fake when D-Day was going to happen, so they made a bunch of inflatable tanks and things like that and rolled them out, and they were sitting around, so the Germans thought that these inflatable tanks were real when they saw them from like aerial images. Meanwhile, they're all over here. There's all sorts of military deceptions that go on. Judges 7 is a famous one. You have Gideon and his 300 men, and God tells him to bang a bunch of pots and have the lanterns and whatnot, so they think there's a big army there, and then they all freak out, so you're deceiving them into thinking there's an army. Judges 3, you have Ehud who goes in to kill Eglon the king, and he's got his knife in his left hand. And he goes to greet him with his right hand because he's left-handed and stabs him. And then beyond that, there's this whole other bucket in the Bible, and there's a lot of this. And this is kind of its own separate issue I don't really want to get into too much because I think we would all agree on it. But there's a ton of civil disobedience issues in the Bible, right? You have the parents of Moses themselves who were told to kill their sons and they don't. You have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel 3 who were told to bow down to the golden idol that Nebuchadnezzar prepared and they don't. You have Daniel defying Darius in chapter 6 when he says you're not supposed to pray. Daniel prays anyway. All sorts of illustrations in the New Testament. Acts 4, for instance, and Sanhedrin go at the apostles and say, you're not supposed to preach anymore. And they get out and they start preaching immediately, and then they end up going to prison off and on. You have the 3 wise men and Herod, and we'll look at this later on. Herod tells them, come back to me and tell me where the child is. God tells them, don't do that. They don't go back. So there's a lot of issues of civil disobedience. I think we would all kind of agree that if the government or someone in authority tells you to do something and it goes against God, don't do it. I don't want to talk too much about that because I think we all kind of agree on that. But at the same time, that is a situation where you're generally supposed to obey authority. You're generally supposed to obey the government. But when it conflicts with this other thing, you're supposed to do this one instead. So that's kind of a background of here's a list of these various issues that come up. that seem to have these apparent conflicts of, do you lie? Do you save life? Do you deceive someone so that you don't die? Do you, obey authority? Do you not obey authority? How about all these different deceiving cases? And what about, all this different stuff, right? So when you get into this situation of ethics, right, there's several big silos of decision making. And nowadays, one of the big silos that you have is this relativism, right? And there's a few different relativism methods that you can look at. There's cultural relativism, which says whatever the culture is doing, that's what you're supposed to do. So and I think there's some aspects of that are right, but I don't think as a whole that's right. There's this cultural relativism, or you have individual relativism, which is kind of popular right now, which is what's right for me is right for me, and what's right for you is right for you, and you can kind of do whatever you want to. So you have that. Then there's situational ethics, which is more of maybe of a classical example, and that's where it just depends on the situation. So you might have a guiding principle of you should love someone, but you don't have any absolutes that are tied to that. It's just that's the absolute. You should love someone, whatever it takes to get that done. And depending on the situation, that's your situational ethics. So in that silo, that's all these different types of relativism. Well, in contrast to relativism, what I believe, and I think what all of you would believe here, is absolutism. So you have relativism, says it's all relative, there are no absolutes. Then you have absolutism, which says there are absolute truths, there are absolute morals. Even though, like we talked about, sometimes it does depend on the situation, but you still have this absolute moral principle that you're supposed to follow, or this moral rule. But here's where it gets more convoluted. In that realm of absolutism, there's 3 different types of absolutism, right? And that's what I want to talk through today. There's 3 different types. There's called conflicting absolutism, graded absolutism, and non-conflicting absolutism. And that might get kind of confusing, but we're going to go through and hopefully you can get an idea of what these look like. And they all have absolutism in their name. Conflicting, graded, non-conflicting absolutism, because they're all in the same bucket, but it's 3 different ways of looking at these scenarios in the Bible, or looking at scenarios in your own life where it seems like there's these apparent moral conflicts, and how do you deal with that? So I want to look through the 3 of these, explain what these are, talk through what I think is maybe not so good about some of them, maybe how they might make sense in another view, and then go through a little bit how that means for us in our own lives. And we'll see if we can do that in about 25 minutes. So the first one is called conflicting absolutism. And this one basically says, I'm going to keep going back to this issue of Rahab, because it's just everyone understands it, right? And the other situation that comes up a lot, or that people talk about, is the issue of the Nazis and the Jews, which is basically like a modern-day Rahab scenario, right? Corrie ten Boom, she's in the Netherlands, she's hiding Jews in her house, they're under the floorboards, they're in the back or whatever. The Nazi officers come up to the door and say, "Are you hiding any Jews in here?" What do you say? Do you say yes? Do you say no? Do you lie to them and say no because you're trying to save their lives? So that's the type of scenario that's kind of the classic example. So I want to use that as an illustration as we go forward. Conflicting absolutism would say, lying is wrong, which we agree with. Telling them that they're here is also wrong, because now you're sending them off to their death. That's also bad. So conflicting absolutism would say both of those are bad choices. Both of those are sin, but you have to pick one, and no matter what you pick, you're sinning. And then you just ask for forgiveness later. So you pick the one that's the less amount of sin. So typically this is easily explained by it saying it's the lesser of 2 evils, if you've heard that. The lesser of 2 evils. They're both evil, and if you pick one, you're picking an evil, but you pick the lesser of 2 evils. And there's a contemporary component of this by the name of John Warwick Montgomery said, just explaining this, the Christian morality fully realizes the difficulty of moral decision making, and frequently a Christian finds himself in a position where it is necessary to make a decision where moral principles must be violated in favor of other moral principles, but he never vindicates himself in this situation. He decides in terms of the lesser of evils, and this drives him to the cross to ask forgiveness for the human situation in which this kind of complication and ambiguity exists. So it's basically saying you pick one and you go to the cross and ask for forgiveness. One interesting thing he brings up, and it raises a good point though, is he talks about this as part of the human situation. And that's true in all of these examples, right? The only reason we even have these conflicts to begin with is because we live in a fallen world, and because there's people with sin nature that are involved. So this isn't something that was intended. This isn't intended as part of God's plan from the creation of the earth that you're going to run into these potential or apparent conflicts. They arise because you have people asking at your door saying, or you have people here so I can kill them, right? Or you have these situations like this that are arising because of human sin. So it's kind of like the divorce situation, right? Where it's like divorce wasn't right, but then God kind of made some examples because people were sinful and was like, well, if there's, adultery or something like that, then, it's not how I intended it, but it can be acceptable. And maybe that's something similar here where this isn't how I wanted it to be, but because you're in a fallen world, it might be how it is. So I got another quote here. We'll skip that. But that's the gist of this. It's basically the lesser of two evils, right? So the pros of this view is it recognizes the fallenness and the sinfulness of man, like Romans 3:23 says. We've all sinned, so it's in a sense it's somewhat inescapable because all have sinned. The other pro here that people offer is it's simple. You don't have to do any sort of analysis much. It's just you have a couple options. They're both sin. You pick the less one. That's it. And then you ask for forgiveness. The cons here, and I think these cons are pretty bad. I don't think this is a good view, personally. I think the other two, which we'll get to, are the ones that are true. The cons here, it seems to conflict with the moral character of God if you're forced into a position where sin is inevitable. If you're forced into the position where you have to choose a sin. That seems to conflict with God. Also, it would create essentially a moral duty to sin, because you're supposed to pick the lesser of two evils. So if you're supposed to pick the lesser one and it's still sin, now you have a moral duty to sin, which is kind of weird. Norman Geisler calls it morally absurd and says, how could there ever be a moral obligation to do something immoral? So I think that's a good point. That's, again, why I don't really like this. The other one is, if you look at the life of Jesus, it says that he was tested in all ways as we are. And these quotes that we have here, people talking about this view, it says these are common conflicts that we run into. Well, if these are common conflicts, it's a necessary part of the human condition, and Jesus was a human and suffered all these things as we did, then you would think he ran into moral conflicts, which under this view would force Jesus to be choosing a sin. Obviously, we know he didn't sin. So those are some pretty big cons with this view. I don't think it's a particularly good view. So next one. So that's called conflicting absolutism. You have these conflicts, they're both sin, lesser of two evils. Next one's called graded absolutism. And graded absolutism is very similar, but instead of being the lesser of two evils, you pick the greater good. So in the situation of Rahab and the spies, you have lying on the one hand, and you have offering up the spies on the other hand. Both of those in a normal situation would be bad to do. But when they conflict with each other, you pick the least wrong one. You pick the greatest good, and when you do so, it's not a sin because you've done the greater good. Okay? So it's similar, but instead of saying they're both sin and you pick a sin, it's saying they're both sin, but you pick one. But when you pick the greater one, you're not sinning. So Norman Geisler writes, he's a big proponent of this, he says, the essential principles of graded absolutism are, there are many moral principles rooted in the absolute moral character of God. There are higher and lower moral duties, for example. Love for God is a greater duty than love for people. These morals sometimes come into unavoidable moral conflict. In such conflicts, we are obligated to follow the higher moral law. When we follow the higher moral law, we are not held responsible for not keeping the lower one. So you've picked the greater good. So the pros of this are it addresses pretty much every constraint or problem with the other one, with conflicting absolutism. It means God's not forcing you into sin. It means Jesus didn't have to choose something that could have potentially be a sin. I think it's grounded in kind of a real-world scenario where you have these choices and you have to do something. I think we'll look at this later. I think there's a strong biblical basis for this interpretation. The cons of this is, despite scriptural evidence, and we'll look at this later, there's no passages that explicitly say that these potential lesser goods are acceptable or doing these things. But that's an issue for all of these. And then also, another problem with this, or potential problem, is it can become subjective and kind of a slippery slope into situational ethics, because you're saying, well, it's the greater good. Well, how do you know what the greater good is? So now you're kind of doing this. So there are some problems. And then the last one, so that's graded. The last one is called non-conflicting absolutism. And non-conflicting absolutism says there was never actually a conflict to begin with. It says when the moral rules actually collide, or that you're required to break one or another, it's not actually real. So one author describes it as, divinely given moral absolutes never truly conflict. Although there are occasions when they appear to conflict, non-conflicting absolutism holds that there will never be a situation in which obedience to one absolute will entail disobedience to or the setting aside of another absolute. Now, The pros of this are it maintains consistency in moral laws, right? So it indicates that they're never required to be broken. Another pro is it avoids potential subjectivity where you have this relativism maybe coming in. The cons of this, and we'll look at this later on here in a minute, is it often relies on hypotheticals that aren't in the text or adding things in saying there's some other way even though we don't know about it. Again, we'll look at this later. I think it tends to resolve things philosophically and not practically, which is somewhat related to this hypothetical scenario. And I think it also tries to remove a human element from decision making. And we'll look at this too, but God often uses people to accomplish his will. And I think this sometimes tries to remove that. So just as a brief summary, you have conflicting absolutism would say, whether Rahab tells the lie, whether they save the people, you're wrong either way, but you pick the lesser of the ones, and then you repent of it later. Graded absolutism would say, you still pick the same choice. You would pick the lie because that's better than killing someone, but when you do that, you're not sinning. Non-conflicting absolutism would look at that scenario and say, there's not actually a conflict here, and you should neither lie nor give them and just do something like stay silent or something like that, which we'll look at here in a minute. But they basically say that you're not forced into this mutually exclusive scenario, and there's some sort of third or alternate way out. So I want to look a little bit more at graded absolutism. And again, like I said, there's people all over the place with this. I'm not so staunch in one view or the other that I think you're wrong if you think the other one. I think conflicting absolutism is wrong, where you think you have to sin no matter what. I don't think that's a good view. But between graded absolutism or non-conflicting absolutism, I could see good people disagreeing on this. As we go through, and I'm going to explain why I think graded absolutism, the middle one we discussed, might be the best route. And I want to look through, why that might be. And I think the Bible seems to indicate that there is a priority or hierarchy of sin. Some sins worse than other ones. And I think we all kind of recognize that too, right? I brought up murder before. I think all of us would agree that murder is worse than being rude to someone. They're both sin. But if I was rude to JB before I came up here, you probably wouldn't say anything, and I could go afterwards and apologize to him. If I murdered JB before I came up here, I probably wouldn't be up here. So I think we all recognize that there is some sort of hierarchy to this, to these sins, right? Or to things, even though they're all wrong. So I'm going to look through some examples in the Bible. Don't have time to go through all of these. But in Matthew 22, verse 37 through 39, Jesus ranked the commandments, calling the love of God the first and great commandment, and the love of neighbor second. We looked at this earlier. And in James 2:8, he actually relates to loving your neighbor as the royal law. So you have that, right? 1 Corinthians 13:13, Paul ranked Christian virtues, saying the greatest of these is charity. In John 19:11, Jesus spoke of greater and lesser sins, telling Pilate, He that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. John 15:13, Jesus spoke of greater love, saying, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. So there was elements of love. Matthew 23:23, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for neglecting the weightier matters of the law, such as judgment, mercy, and faith. Matthew 23:24, the very next verse, Jesus contrasted minor and major matters, saying, they strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. So you have these different size things. In Ephesians in 6:1 through 3, and Matthew 10:37, Scripture commands us to honor our parents, yet Jesus taught that loyalty to him must come first, saying, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. So you have this element of degrees. And then in Acts 4:19 and 5:29 and Romans 13:1 through 7, you see Peter and John chose obedience to God over human authorities, saying, we ought to obey God rather than men. There's some scenarios. There's a lot of scriptural evidence there where you have God saying, greatest of these, first and great commandment, greater sins, greater love, weightier matters, gnats versus camels, loving Father more than me. So you have all these different things that kind of have the same, seem to be implying some sort of hierarchy to sins, right? Go to 1 Samuel 21. I want to look at an example here, and this is one that we skipped when we were going through before because I wanted to talk about it in a little more depth. And I think this is an instructive one as we're thinking through this principle of, well, maybe there's some sort of weight or some sort of degrees to these sins. That's why it's called graded absolutism, because you're grading things. 1 Samuel 21. So here's a situation. We looked in the past verse or chapter, actually, when Saul was angry and he's throwing spears, and Michal lied to protect him, then Jonathan lied to protect him. So he's on the run with some of his men. And you get to verse 21, or chapter 21. Verse 1 says, Then came David to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, Why art thou alone, and no man with thee? So he's on the run. David's still the captain of the army, so the priest is kind of scared. He's saying, why is the captain of Saul's army coming to him? You're the captain. Where's everyone with you? Why are you alone? Verse 2, And David said unto Ahimelech the priest, The king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, Let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee. And I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. So in the first instance here, we see David lying about this. He's basically saying, I'm on a secret mission from Saul. He's like, I'm not running from Saul. I'm on a secret mission from him, and I need your help, right? I don't want to talk too much about that because we've talked about some of these lying scenarios before, but I want to go forward and look at the next thing that happens. In verse 3, it says, David says, Now therefore, what is under thine hand? What do you have? Do you have anything for me? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present. So David's on the run. Him and his men need food. They're probably starving. They have to eat something. David comes to the priest. He comes to someone where, I don't know who's going to help me. Maybe I can get some help in the house of God. Maybe I can get some help from the priest, get some help in the temple. And he says, What do you have here that I can eat? In verse 4, the priest answered David and said, There is common bread under mine hand, but there is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. So what's going on here? What is he talking about with hallowed bread? Well, we won't go to it, but Leviticus 24, 5 through 9 sets out. So in the temple, you have all these different areas of the temple, and you have, the altar, and you have in the Holy of Holies, you have the Ark of the Covenant, but you have these different aspects going on. One of them is the table of showbread, and you have this table of showbread in Leviticus 24, 5 through 9. If you look at that later, it basically says you have this bread, you set it out, it waits there for a week. On the 7th day, it's the priest's bread, and the priest is to eat the bread. And it specifically says this is the bread for the priest, right? So that's what he's saying here. The priest is saying, I don't have anything here. I don't have any common bread. The only bread I have is the bread that only the priests are supposed to eat. And I think the priest knows that. He knows that he's not supposed to give it to anyone. He knows this is only for the priest, but he's thinking, well, I guess if I'm going to give it to him anyway, let me see if they're at least clean. And we'll at least do something. So we ask them if they're holy, and if the vessels of the young men are holy. And then in verse 6 it says, So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So, again, so he's on the run. And I think here's an important detail. Why is David there to begin with, right? David's not going around, he's not going around to Nob, he's not going around to Ahimelech because he's trying to subvert the will of God, or he's trying to do something that he's not supposed to be doing, or he has a bad heart, or he has a bad intent that he's trying to do. He's going there because he's trying to follow God, right? And he ends up in this situation where he needs food because he's trying to follow God. So this isn't a situation where he's put himself in the bad situation. He's put himself here because of trying to follow what's right. And here's the quandary, though, and here's what I want to look at. The priest has a choice, right? The priest can either say, this bread's only for me. You're not allowed to eat this bread. Or he can say, if I don't give you this bread, you might starve. You might die if I don't give this to you. So he has a choice. He can say, no, I don't have any bread here. This is my bread. You can't have any of it. Or he can give it to him. And the priest chooses to give it to him. And David, from the other perspective, can say, I'm not supposed to eat this bread. This is the bread only for the priest. I shouldn't be eating this. This is breaking Leviticus 24. Maybe I should just not eat it and I should, starve or whatever instead. But David chooses to eat the bread, right? Because he's on the run, because he's trying to please God. So how would each of the 3 theories that we looked at look at this, right, from David's perspective? If you're a conflicting absolutist, you would say eating the bread's a sin, killing yourself by starving or having your men starve is also a sin, but eating the bread's the lesser one. You do it, you're sinning, you move on. Graded absolutism would have the same perspective, but say you eat the bread because it's the greater good to do, because it's better to break the ceremonial law than it is to kill someone. And you would say you're not sinning in doing that. A non-conflicting absolutist would come into the situation and say that there's another route that you could go. You don't have to eat the bread. You can go and, find something else to eat, essentially. So if this was the only time this story came up in the Bible, you might be left with kind of an open-ended, well, I don't know, how should we handle this, right? It might be kind of like a Rahab. There is some stuff with Rahab later on in the Bible, but it might be more of a Rahab scenario. It might be more of, a Jonathan and David lying scenario. But we do have a reference to this in the Bible. Go to Matthew 12. This does come up later on in the Bible. Matthew 12, verse 1. Actually comes up 3 times in the Bible, all 3 of the first Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We'll look at a couple of them. It does come up. So Matthew 12, verse 1 says, "At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were and hungered, and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat." Verse 2, "But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." So let's stop there for a second. What's happening here, right? So the Pharisees, well, first of all, why are the Pharisees even following Jesus around on the Sabbath day as he's walking through a cornfield? They're trying to find some way to trap him. And the Pharisees, as you're aware, is you have all these the Mosaic law that they're still bound by under this, and the Pharisees have added all of these different additional restrictions on top of this. So the Sabbath the law says don't work on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees have come in and said, well, what does work mean? Work doesn't, work is an ambiguous term. Work can mean all sorts of things. So they've added all these different things, and one of the ways that they view this is that if you're looking through, do I have this reference here? I do. So Deuteronomy 23:25 says. And this is part of the law. So when you're looking at this aspect of eating the corn, here's what's happening. "When thou comest into the standing corn of thy neighbor, then thou mayest pluck the ears with thine hand, but thou shalt not move a sickle unto thy neighbor's standing corn." So that's what Jesus and the disciples are following here. That was part of the law. If you're walking through a field and you get hungry, you're allowed to take some of the stuff on the edge of it, kind of the stuff that's been left that you're allowed to glean, and you're able to come through, eat some of the food, but you're not supposed to take a sickle to it and start taking whole bushels of the stuff home. In the previous verse in Deuteronomy, it talks about walking through a vineyard, and you're not supposed to be putting a bunch of wine in baskets and buckets and taking, all these grapes home with you. It's like if you take one, you can eat it, but you're not supposed to fill. And I think we all kind of understand what's talking about here. It's just like you're walking through, you need something to eat, you take a little bit, but you're not making a whole meal out of it. And that's what Jesus and the disciples are doing here. But the Pharisees have added to this law, this not working on the Sabbath. So what they see is, and what their rule was, as you grab that ear of wheat off wheat, not corn. You grab that ear of wheat off of you pluck it, well, that's harvesting, because you've harvested that wheat. And now when you take off the little shells and you kind of winnow it away and you get down to the seed, that's threshing. So now you've harvested and you've threshed on the Sabbath day, and that's work. So they prohibited people from doing that because they interpreted that as work, right? And that's where Jesus says, so they're trying to trap him and saying, aha, you're breaking our rules here. And in verse 3, Jesus replies to them, and it says, he said unto them, "Have ye not read what David of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat?" And it says right there, what David did, that was not lawful for him to eat it. He wasn't supposed to eat it. But what does Jesus say? "Neither for them that were with him, but only for the priests." What's the implication here? Jesus, and it goes forward, but Jesus is clearly implying that even though that was unlawful, that was okay to do in that situation. It was not lawful for David to eat the bread, but it was the situation he was in made it lawful in the same way, in a similar way. It's not lawful. And Jesus brings this up all the time. When James Knox was here a couple weeks ago, he brought up the situation of the oxen falling in the pit, right? The oxen falls in on the Sabbath. Which one of you doesn't take him up out of the pit? Well, that probably involves a lot of work taking the oxen out of the pit, but it's even though it might be considered work on the Sabbath, there's kind of these exemptions or exceptions to it because of the loss of life. And the same thing happens with the man with the withered hand, right? He's healed on the Sabbath, comes in, heals him. And that's basically what Jesus is saying here, but he uses David's illustration to prove that point, that there can be these conflicts, but even though it was unlawful, it wasn't for him at the time. And then he gives another example, verse 5, or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath day the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Well, he's referencing their priests do work all the time on the Sabbath. That's kind of when they do their most work, even though you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Priests do it because they have this exemption for them, because they're allowed to. In verse 6, but I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. And I think that's kind of an important thing in this context is, again, Jesus is comparing mercy and sacrifice. Well, we know Jesus and God want sacrifice. We know they want mercy. But here it says, I will have mercy and not sacrifice. So there's this hierarchy of things. I would rather have mercy than sacrifice. It's not saying you don't God doesn't want sacrifice, but there's this hierarchy to it. Go to Mark, because I said this is in all the synoptic gospels. In Mark 2, we have the same situation, but Mark points out one other thing that I think is helpful here. In Mark 2, verses 23, lays out the exact same scenario, and it came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began, it is corn, I thought it was corn, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath that which is not lawful? And he, Jesus, said unto them, Have ye never read what David did when he had need and was an hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat but for the priests, and gave also to them which were with him. Here's the key thing that Mark says Luke doesn't, or Matthew doesn't say, or Luke. And he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Right? So what's he saying here? He's setting out this principle-based thing and saying the reason the Sabbath was enacted was because God wanted people to have a day of rest. The reason for the Sabbath wasn't some sort of legalistic thing where if you do all these acts and works and things, you're making yourself more righteous before God. The Sabbath was made for man. The Sabbath was made to give you rest. And what's happening here is you're putting all these different rules and all these different restrictions on this thing, and you're basically taking it away, and you're saying man was made for the Sabbath, right? And you're saying you can't do all these different works. You can't, eat the showbread that was offered because, the whole ceremonial aspect of the law is made so that you could be righteous. And there's an aspect to that, but what he's saying here is man was not made for the Sabbath. Or I've got that backwards. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? So God seems to be setting out this principle hierarchy of even though the Sabbath rules are there, if it comes into conflict with the purpose of why the rule was created to begin with, which was to benefit man and to bring them rest, if it conflicts with that, then you're not supposed to follow that because there's this other guiding principle that you're supposed to follow, right? And I think that's where I would say I'm leaning towards this graded absolutist standard where you have this hierarchy of principles. And if personally, and maybe you'll say this is maybe some of you here, I think some of you would agree with me and some of you might not agree with me, which is fine. If the Nazis come to my door and say, do you have Jews with you? I would probably lie to them and say no, even though lying is normally not wrong. And I understand people here might have other opinions on that, and I'm agree to be persuaded. I could be persuaded one way or the other. But I think there's a biblical case that you can make that there's these hierarchy of sins that when they conflict with each other, that you choose the greater good. I think that's the key. You choose the greater good, and you're not sinning in doing so, right? And I think I don't have time. I have a whole nother section here on some more reasons why I believe this. I don't have time to get into that because we only got a couple minutes. But I think, we have, there's some real world examples that this can come up into. I won't go into those, but, actually kind of an interesting one people bring up in all these different Christian ethics books. It's kind of silly. Is like, you leave the house and you go on vacation and you leave your lights on so that you're deceiving would-be criminals from thinking you're home. I mean, there's all sorts of situations like this that come up like, well, is that right? You're deceiving the people. But I think at baseline, there's a lot of confusing things that you can get into and say, this is kind of confusing which way you would go or the other. But I think when you're looking at this situation of lying over human life, following ceremonial laws, following rules that were made for to help men, not to hurt them, when you have this issue of conflicts that involve life, I think there's two principles that we can get here, at least, I think, as a baseline. All of these examples in the Bible all involve the imminent preservation of life, right? It was the situation of Rahab and the spies. I mean, or the Nazis and the Jews or whatever. That's imminent preservation of life, right? The situation of David eating the bread, presumably it's imminent preservation of life. The issue of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? It's this. They're not following the law there. All the examples of lying, Michael lying about David's whereabouts, David and Jonathan lying about that, Samuel being told by God to lie about, or at least deceive about what he was doing, all involved, Samuel thought Saul was going to kill him. They all involve this imminent preservation of life. So I think if you're in a situation where there's a conflict, at least, I think you can say at a minimum, I think you can, where there's an imminent preservation of life issue, then you follow the thing that results in the lesser problem. You follow the greater good. And I think that kind of combats one of the issues that people have with this graded absolutism standard, which is that it can devolve into moral relativism and just situational ethics, and you do whatever you want. Sometimes a scenario people bring up is, if you're working with someone and your coworker does something wrong, do you lie to the employer to preserve his job? Because if you don't preserve the guy's job, now he's out of a job. Now he can't afford food. Now his kids are going to starve. They're going to be in the streets because he got fired. It's like, well, now you're down like 6 different scenarios here before you get to the actual impact that you say you're trying to do. Or I think there's a whole slew of things that could be self-imposed. An example that I saw come up in a lot of these Christian ethics books was people saying, I watch pornography so I don't engage in fornication, and it's better to do this than to do this other one. I don't think that's not the moral of what we're talking about here, right? Because those are situations that you've put yourself into a position where you have to do the other. That's not what's happening here. In all of these scenarios, it's someone else, an outside influence, is putting you into a situation where there's an imminent threat to life, and you have to choose to do one of these. So I think at a minimum, that would be where I would say, and I think maybe you could go further than that, but that's up for debate. But at a minimum, I think if you have these conflicting things, God wants you to follow the greater good, follow the principle of why these rules were created to begin with, which was meant to be a help to man and not a constraint on man necessarily, and live in this law of liberty. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, or at least it's interesting, or maybe you're just really confused and want it to be done, but that's what we got this morning at 10 o'clock. So let's pray and we'll get going. God, thank you for this time we have today that we can look into your word and see some different aspects of your character and how you would like us to handle things. And I pray that in these areas that are tough, or these areas that are debatable, areas that are gray, that you would give us wisdom regardless of what the correct outcome might be. But I pray that you would just give us wisdom in handling these matters of day-to-day life, and these matters of Christian ethics, and these matters of how do we handle, everything in life based off the principles that you've given us through your word. How do we apply those? And I pray you just give us wisdom there. Be with us the rest of this morning here in church. Amen.